Tendrils of darkness disappeared into Ludmilla's outstretched hand, filling her being with a variety of vibrant and familiar sensations. The resolve to act with violence. The desperate struggle for survival. The pain that came with conflict, both physical and emotional. Even as a human, it was all something she had long learned to harbor within herself, become accustomed to. Since childhood, she had shared in it all. The patrols that came back with casualties, the loss of friends and family, the resolve to carry on and fight until one's dying breath. To kill or be killed. As she took in the sensations, the emotional imprint of deaths that she had ordered in the Battle of the Upper Reaches, Ludmilla supposed she was never what one might consider a good person. She fulfilled her duties in ways that tended to drive fear into the hearts of others. Was it a strange vice that she subconsciously enjoyed? Probably not, it was simply the way she was raised to fight. She was the product of generations of hard lessons on the frontier, where her house and its people had fought a long, unrecognized war in the shadows. As a result, sowing death appeared to be the one thing that she excelled at above all else, and now it seemed that she could reap it. She closed her outstretched hand, lowering it to her side. Was it even necessary? At first, she feared that the battles in the wilderness would turn the area into a wasteland filled with the undead. Her fears were unfounded, however. Throughout the time that the Lynam sisters organized anti-undead patrols, nothing of note had been reported. Nature was more resilient than she had given it credit for. Like the Xenon members she spoke to had mentioned, it took a lot to throw off the balance. The remains of every single demi-human camp that she had destroyed were already well on their way to being reclaimed. What she was doing now just seemed like she was expediting things rather than fixing them. Ludmilla took a deep breath, trying once again to figure out what absorbing this negative energy meant. She had been wandering up and down for days, with no discernible change to show for it. No, that wasn't quite right. As she made her rounds, she grew aware of something manifesting, something along the lines of an ability or a skill. As long as it lay within her realm of responsibility, she could sense negative energy. It didn't matter how minute or remote it was, she could pinpoint it at any time, from any location. Rather than anything that felt suited to one of the undead, some dark ability that was the stuff of nightmares, it was more like the uncanny ability of her household staff to detect dust in the most obscure and hard-to-reach places of her manor. Rather than naming her warden, they should have probably called her a maid. An undead maid. A death maid. Maybe I should report to Miss Alpha for training, she mused to herself. Ludmilla didn't feel any particular compulsion to go after any of it, but it didn't hurt to pick up if it was on the way. Though her thoughts on this aspect of her new nature were decidedly casual, she was still slowly developing an appreciation for what it meant. Ilishnish's outburst during their investigation was particularly shocking. It was the closest she had ever witnessed the Frost Dragon come to expressing something like genuine concern. Even so, it felt alien to her. It was as if Ilishnish was not worried for Ludmilla personally, but worried about some greater thing that Ludmilla had no awareness of. For her part, Ludmilla only understood that she was something of a paradox. She was an undead being, yet unlike the naturally manifested undead that acted to propagate negative energy to create more undead, she did the opposite. A walking countermeasure against the advance of negative energy ecologies. Something like a wolf in sheep's clothing? Did that make her the natural enemy of the undead, despite being one of the undead? His Majesty's undead servitors didn't seem to react to her any differently than before. Though she had not visited recently, Lady Shiltir only appeared to be pleased over her new existence. Granted, Ludmilla had not submitted any of her recent findings to her liege yet, but natural reactions to rivals, predators and competitors tended to be easily discernible. Arriving at the remains of the next camp, Ludmilla felt the familiar sensations suffuse into her body as she stepped into its midst. I should formally claim this place already. I'm already taking care of it. How would the slain theocracy react? Clara managed the Sorceress Kingdom's current standing border with their neighbor to the south, and there had been no incidents to speak of. She had an advantage in the fact that she ruled over a completely human population that shared the same faith, however. If Ludmilla extended her management over the upper reaches, her protection would extend over hundreds of demi-human tribes. Would the theocracy still move to suppress non-human populations in their area, despite said non-humans being members of an officially recognized state? What would she do if they did? The question left a sour taste in her mouth, One that was by far more disagreeable than absorbing the negative energy imprint of thousands of obliterated demi-humans. She hoped that it wouldn't happen, but each nation had its own agendas. Just as Ludmilla did what she thought was best for her territory, so should the leaders of any population. The slain theocracy had taken on the additional burden of being caretakers of humanity and had long acted to assist the younger human nations around it. For now, they maintained strict neutrality when it came to their relations with the Sorceress Kingdom, but there was no telling when that might change. The scripture members she had encountered seemed reasonable enough, friendly even. They were more curious than fearful and empathized with many of her concerns. A part of her wanted to believe that everyone from the theocracy was like that. According to Clara, who had been on several pilgrimages to the south, it was merely the sort of behavior they displayed towards fellow adherents of the faith. Once, when House Zaradnik only ruled over humans, this would have meant the same thing to her either way. Now, she was left to puzzle out what she could do to eliminate the risk of cross-border incidents. Keeping open lines of communication seemed the surest way to prevent misunderstandings and to escalate any situations that arose. Despite their neutral stance, however, the slain theocracy had not sent any ambassadors to the Sorceress Kingdom. It may have been because the temples were an institution that influenced all aspects of life in the theocracy. They may have been treating temples in the Duchy of Erantal the same way. Bishop Austin didn't have anywhere near the political or economic clout attributed to a bishop in the theocracy, however. He simply reported to his superiors, made recommendations where he was legally entitled, and did his best to manage the resurgent numbers of the faithful. Perhaps Ludmilla needed to set something up on her own. It was long past time for her domain to receive temple staff. Even a local temple branch that kept couriers and pilgrims flowing over the border would be better than what she currently had access to. With the Sorceress Kingdom's undead patrols, it would be safe enough. Ludmilla made her way eastwards, following the old wilderness trail that led over the southeastern pass to the theocracy. Her senses led her towards another patch of negative energy, high above the places that the goblin army occupied. It was from an older conflict, its remaining vestiges already on the verge of being cleansed by nature. No physical traces of what had occurred could be detected. The sensations that came with the residual traces of negative energy, however, were well worn and familiar. The resolve to act with violence. The struggle for life. The pain of injury, the pain of loss. No matter who they were, it seemed, the conflicts of the living left the same impressions. She wondered if the place where she stood was the site of some act of demi-human suppression by the forces of the theocracy. It was just the sort of thing she would now have to be wary of. Lady Zaradnik? A familiar voice sounded in her head, and Ludmilla raised her hand to her ear out of habit. Yes? This is Bestonia. I've called to inform you that we're about to begin our preparations. Is it that time already? I must have lost track somehow. The sessions for the morning ended early. We're at Corlin Manor at the moment. I can open a gate for you if you wish, Juan. That would be wonderful, Miss Bestonia. Thank you very much. It was time. Ludmilla took a deep breath, trying to settle the sudden nerves that rose out of the depths of her being. A moment later, a dark line slashed across the air, expanding into the familiar portal of the gate spell. Taking one last look around, she allowed herself a satisfied nod before stepping through. Stamp. Flip. Stamp. Flip. Staha? Ein Zulgaun, the Sorcerer King, barely caught himself before stamping his desk. The crimson points of his eyes scanned the polished surface before he cleared his throat. Albedo. Yes, Ein Summer? Today's workload appears to be quite light. Indeed, Ein Summer, Albedo replied serenely. With the approach of the autumn harvest season, both city businesses and the local leaders habitually get their affairs in order. I would not say that it's an unwelcome thing, but one would rather that they stay on top of things in a more uniform manner. Crunch time. Wait, does that mean I've caught up? I suppose things might have become onerous for you, Not at all, Ein Summer. Though domestic matters have settled down somewhat, the recommendations we've made regarding the Imperial Legions have required a delicate balancing act. I recall that Jerkniv was quite shocked when you proposed them. You mentioned that they were cooperating. Has something changed in the state of affairs between us? Though her smile remained pristine, Albedo's voice seemed to curl into a sneer. Nothing of the sort, Ein Summer. she replied. It's just that humans are such a needy and wasteful species. If it wasn't for your intent for the Baharuth Empire to become a model protectorate, I would have simply ordered everyone involved to crawl into their holes and die. They can always breed more later. Ma, we can afford a little bit of patience, no? He made a casual sweep of his hand. We're trying to cultivate the best possible results here. Of course. It is as you say, Ein Summer. They are as maggots squirming helplessly in the palm of your hand. Don't put maggots in my palm, please. Despite all that had happened, it seemed that Albedo held firm to her stance against outsiders in general. There were next to none that weren't deficient in some aspect of their personality or capability. Would it ever change? He could only hope. Never mind finding friends for his friends' children, he couldn't even find colleagues for this particular child. Speaking of cultivated results, Demiurge should be advancing on the Holy Kingdom soon, shouldn't he? Yes, Ein Summer, Albedo replied. He's truly outdone himself this time. All relevant species have been analyzed, useful ones have been set aside and prepared for integration into the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Problematic races have been gathered into the Demon Emperor's army. He has even managed to secure a plentiful and willing supply of cheap, high-quality equipment for them. What of the other nations in the region? There's no indication that they suspect anything. The elves of Evansa are preoccupied with their own matters. The slain theocracy has no cause to connect Yaldabaoth to us. Riastais remains ignorant as always. Due to Demiurge's machinations, the Demon Emperor has been made to be an enemy of all. Everything is going according to plan. Umu. In other words, this would be his only chance. Once Demiurge set his plan into motion, Ainz would have to begin preparing for his role in it all. He had some of his own ideas to add, as well. Have we learned anything of the Holy Kingdom's paladins? He asked. Demiurge indicated it highly likely that the delegation they send to us would be headed by them. Followers of the four elemental gods are vehemently opposed to the undead, and their holy warriors might be particularly zealous. Enough to complicate our plans. Albedo snorted dismissively. Humph. If those could be called paladins, then we may as well put one of Gyuhuku's summons on a horse and call it a blackguard. We do have a case study on what the locals consider paladins inbound, however. A contingent from the slain theocracy has been pre-approved for entry. Though they are not of the same religion, we should be able to prepare an appropriate response to the main event by using them as a rough model for our expectations. There's really nothing to do, huh? Then there's nothing to do but to do it. Ainz put his completed work aside and rose from his seat. The sentries around the room redoubled their vigilance, and the maid on duty grew sharply attentive. He mustered up an appropriately authoritative tone. In that case, thank you for your hard work, Albedo. Since things should be quiet for the next little while, I will be attending to a matter that I have set aside for far too long. Clear my schedule, I am not to be disturbed until I return. Albedo lowered her head in reverence. By your command, Ein Summer. Ainz strode at a stately pace out of the office and through the corridor. He stopped by his bedroom to pick up several books he had left on the nightstand. Unlike the cerebral texts that he usually placed there, these were ones he had keenly perused over the last few weeks. They were records translated from the Adventurer Guild and the Imperial Legions, as well as tales compiled from local lore. Stories of a lush and fertile land that had abruptly fallen to shadow, never to recover. The Katsa Plains. The more Ainz read about it, the more he wanted to go. There were so many conflicting tales about the place that it was impossible to tell truth from fable. Excitement over what he would discover threatened to disturb his regal gait. A few things were agreed upon by most. First was that an ancient metropolis lurked somewhere in the mists. The second was that there was an elder lich who captained some sort of ghost ship, something like a Flying Dutchman. If he could get his hands on that elder lich, he would finally have an intelligent undead of this world to study. He couldn't go alone, of course, despite it being an undead-infested area. Because it was an undead-infested area, however, the choice of his escort was clear. Ainz cast a message spell, raising a hand to his head. Shiltir. Ein Summer? There is something you require my assistance with. Sunlight streamed through the curtains of the nearby window, spilling over the bed to set 1,000 glittering diamonds aflame. Any awe over the dazzling sight was suppressed by the solemn atmosphere, however, and Ludmilla gave Clara's trembling hand a squeeze. Her friend squeezed her back in reply, and together they looked across the bed at the third figure in the room. Dressed in the luxurious maid outfit customary to the Sorcerer King's household, Miss Pestonia waited expectantly. An audible swallow rose from Clara, and she finally nodded. Pestonia raised her arms. True resurrection. A magic circle formed over the bed, suffusing the carpet of diamonds with an angelic blue hue. Ludmilla held her breath, and Clara did the same. The magical light faded, and the sun reasserted its dominance. The bed, however, no longer glittered with diamonds. Clara leaned forward slightly over the silken sheets. She sent a questioning look in Miss Pestonia's direction. The Sorcerer King's housekeeper only shook her head silently in return. Clara's hand grew cold, tightening its grip. Ludmilla quickly spoke. "Thank you, Miss Pestonia," she said. "Please don't let us keep you here." A gate opened on Miss Pestonia's side of the bed. With one last, respectful nod, she disappeared through the portal. Ludmilla caught Clara as she collapsed, pulling her close. It failed. Clara's voice was filled with disbelief. "WH." A violent sob racked her shoulders, and her wails rose to fill the room. Tears streaming down her own cheeks, Ludmilla brought them to sit down on a long sofa. "I worked so hard," Clara said between shuddering breaths. "I wanted them to come back and see. I wanted to see the proud look on Father's face." Clara's sobs started anew, and she clutched at Ludmilla desperately. It was something that they all felt. In the wake of catastrophe, unprecedented peace and prosperity had come to their lands. House Corlin, especially, had grown from its small barony between Erantle and the Katza River to a burgeoning county that controlled the majority of the fertile riverlands. After discovering that Ludmilla had been resurrected several times in adventurer training, Clara started considering whether it was possible to bring their families back. It was something that they did not dare to hope over, at first, but as they grew accustomed to the new administration and developed a sense of its needs, Clara became reasonably confident that it would work. The Sorcerer's Kingdom had elder liches aplenty to act as clerks and scribes, collecting and organizing information. What it lacked was skilled and loyal administrators capable of making the appropriate decisions based on that information, the nation's policies, and the needs of its people. One of the reasons why Clara had catapulted so far ahead of everyone else was because she was building a case for the excellence of House Corlin. Little did they know that, despite receiving the approval of the royal court, the resurrection would be rejected by the recipient himself. Clara had meant for the return of her father to be a kindling of hope for the others, showing that their lost fathers, brothers and sons could be brought back to them. Now, Ludmilla wondered how much fresh heartbreak it would bring if everyone tried. Several hours later, after their grief had abated, Clara quietly lay with her head on Ludmilla's lap. Ludmilla idly stroked Clara's strands of shimmering golden hair, as if the movement might be keeping her calm somehow. "It is time to go," Clara said at long last. "There is nothing left for us here." Ludmilla's hand stopped, and she looked down at Clara. "Will your household be all right?" she asked. "They must have heard me weeping this entire time," Clara replied. "I am sure they have figured out what has happened. As long as I continue to lead House Corlin, they should be fine." Clara's amethyst eyes turned up at her. "And as long as I have you, I will be fine." Ludmilla poked her in the cheek, eliciting a smile. They got up and straightened out their frumpled dresses, and Ludmilla went to check the hallway. Outside the door to the solar, she found Clara's lady's maid, Ty Aramis, waiting. Her eyes were red and raw, but she rose from her seat to look towards Ludmilla tentatively. "My lady." "We're moving." Clara appeared from behind Ludmilla. "Let the others know." Countess Corlin's voice carried a resolve harder than adamantite, and Ty's response was immediate. "Yes, my lady." With a quick curtsy, she swiftly headed back down the corridor. Clara walked over towards her room. "Will you be staying to help?" she asked. "I do not have any commitments scheduled until tomorrow," Ludmilla answered, "so I should be able to remain for at least that long. It will take a long time to move everything, though. Your wardrobe alone will take over a week." Clara shot her a look over her shoulder. "I don't have that much." "You do." "Well, we have the Death Knights to help, so it will be quick." Ludmilla walked over to the bedroom window, peeking down at the yard. "What about the manor gardens? Your family has been cultivating them for generations." "We're moving the entire grounds to one of the castle gardens. I'm certainly not leaving your favorite part of the manor behind. Ludmilla settled down beside Clara, helping her sort out one of her drawers. The sounds of the Call-in household beginning their work rose from downstairs. Clara's burst of energy drained away by noon, and they stopped to refresh themselves with a light lunch. So even with Sursana's approval, her friend muttered softly to herself, the individual will of the soul still matters. Ludmilla paused, a piece of bread soaked in stew half raised to her mouth. I have been meaning to ask, Ludmilla said. Have you personally seen His Majesty? Yes, Clara replied. You have been to the theocracy on pilgrimage several times. There must have been frescoes, ancient tapestries and relics, the art of the great cathedrals. Clara took a few spoonfuls of her own stew, taking her time with it before answering. Have you traveled much around my domain? She asked. I have only looked around the harbor for any great period of time, Ludmilla answered. Well, what you have probably noticed in the harbor town is much the same as everywhere else. Then, Clara held her gaze while shaking her head. If it is, then it is. Either way, our duties do not change. Why the sudden interest, anyway? I saw His Majesty for the first time over a month ago, Ludmilla told her. It was right after everything happened. Recently, I have learned some other things about myself. Dame Verilyn says that something like this does not just happen. It has to be facilitated somehow. And it has to be allowed. Clara slowly rolled a mouthful of dark wine over her tongue, a thoughtful expression on her face. What did His Majesty say about it? I am not sure if he said anything at all, Ludmilla replied. I took one look at him and ran away. You fled from our sovereign? Ludmilla. Embarrassment crept up Ludmilla's neck. It is different for me, her voice was heated. I do not see him as humans do. It is like Lady Shiltir whenever you hear her speak of His Majesty, amplified to an overwhelming degree. I never imagined that it would be in this state that I would first feel like this about a man. Is it really that bad? It is. Even the memory of the Sorcerer King still bothered her. She did not think she could ever get used to it. Your physiological reactions aside, Clara told her, I do not think you should share those thoughts about the origin of your existence with anyone else. Even with what is happening in your domain? Especially with what is going on in my domain, Clara said. Faith is a wonderful thing, but it can also turn into something terrible. The people here are confident in the rightness of their path and the sound leadership of the realm. We have achieved an ideal balance that these territories have never seen before. However, it is possible that the faith of the people might be pushed too far in an attempt to edify it. Ludmilla furrowed her brow, trying to envision what her friend described. And what would it look like if it was pushed too far? Not very much different from what you see right now, I suspect, Clara replied. Which is the scariest part about it? It will have advanced too far by the time you have realized the problem. His Majesty keeps a strictly secular government, and he has given no indication that he wishes to interfere with religious affairs. I believe that this is one of the reasons why. So you do believe that he's? I do, Clara said. Which makes it a priceless honor to be a noble in His Majesty's service, do you not agree? It wasn't a matter of agreeing or not. It simply was, without question. A god had come to walk amongst them, and they were in the enviable position of being his subjects. To followers of the Six, it was the answer to a heartfelt prayer, a return to a time thought forever lost. You know I do, Ludmilla replied. But I do not understand how my existence would influence the people's faith. Consider what you said just now, Clara told her. That your new existence must have been facilitated somehow, and it had to have been allowed. Sursana holds purview over the souls of humanity. Your human soul has been allowed to return in the form of a being that is undead, a state associated with our god of death. That you are a noble and an adherent of Sursana just nudges things along. Once your existence enters the imagination of the public, you will end up as the chosen of Sursana, proof of our god's blessing upon the people and our realm. After that, they will saint you and give you a portable shrine to carry around. I must have missed that memo. It does not matter that you did, Clara smirked. People believe what they want to believe. Another reason to remain silent on the matter of her existence and its purpose. As if unknowingly making enemies of dragons and shadowy necromantic organizations wasn't bad enough. What about merchants and travelers from the theocracy? Ludmilla asked, The amount of traffic going to and from the south is steadily increasing. They do not stop in Irantal, Clara answered, but they have probably picked out the details of those statues from the crossroads by now. I suppose that the people of the theocracy are who I am mostly worried about these days. As a nation, they should have sent their agents over to take a look around, and the temples of the six here regularly report to their superiors in the south. There is no way that the High Council of the slain theocracy is unaware of what has happened here. What does it mean for them? For those well grounded in the faith, well educated and possessing experience in the wide world, they might be considered to be like us, save for being raised in a place where the temples have more power. It is the common folk of recent generations that have become a cause for growing concern. The foreign policy of the slain theocracy has grown increasingly aggressive since the time of the demon gods, and the way they have been influencing the masses has been altered to match. This was something that the faithful in the duchy felt keenly when dealing with their brethren from the south. Due to a combination of circumstances, those in the sorceress kingdom practiced a version of the faith reminiscent of the times before the demon gods. It was what was best suited for the faith's evangelists and missionaries to bring to a land where the temples had no power beyond what was commonly recognized as their purview. It wasn't just in how the masses were directed, but the way that the theocracy moved in the shadows of the northern kingdoms, too. As a frontier noble, their long-time assistance with deadly threats to the border had always been a welcome thing. As Ludmilla became more aware of other matters, however, she noticed where their southern neighbor might be doing more than just helping to keep dangers to humanity suppressed. What is the purpose in doing that? Of that, I have no idea, Clara replied. Creating suitable public outlook for pursuing territorial and ideological objectives, perhaps. What I do know for sure is that the people as a whole have started to lose their way. Faith is being supplanted by fanaticism, and that fanaticism has taken on a life of its own. It is to the point that I question whether they follow the same scriptures, or if they follow what they collectively believe the scriptures to say without proper study or guidance. In other words, popular notions rather than correct ones could seize control of the consensus. From there, the situation could go in any direction. The High Council of the theocracy would not allow this situation to stand, Ludmilla said. It was the High Council of the theocracy that initiated this whole shift in national attitudes, Clara replied, but I agree. In the wake of the demon gods, they started the great seeding and spread humanity throughout the region. They have been increasingly active in espionage, politics and military actions. Everything they have done has been purposeful, but something went wrong recently. Now, they are stuck with the population with the sort of thinking that they thought would be suited for whatever their objective was supposed to be by this point. What can they do to solve it? I am not sure that they can, Clara sighed. It is the exact reason why I do not wish for anything of the sort to happen here. The theocracy invested generations into this, and now all they can probably do is hope that calms down before it runs off without them. I pray that they will be able to as well. They are our brothers and sisters in the faith, not our enemies. Clara left many things unspoken between them, but they were both well aware of the crisis looming on the horizon. The faithful of the sorceress kingdom held the truth close to their hearts, content that better times had come. The people of the theocracy, however. What would happen if they discovered that the greatest of the six had returned? The snort of a horse carried into the cool morning air, over the murmur of an unseen river. Layered in thick mists, the broad valley was cloaked in an eerie stillness. Every unknown sound and movement made Marcus Cavallaro peer sharply in its direction. The shrouded hours of the early morning were the most dangerous time of day in the Riverlands. Though it should be safe enough where they were, he could never truly settle down in these surroundings. A paladin stationed in the fortress of Altamura and a native of the Riverlands himself, he had seen too many times what could happen if one dropped their guard against the morning fog. Inhabitants of the area held a belief that the evil mist over the nearby Katza plains would reach out and up into the Riverlands, mingling with the daily fog and taking advantage of those who thought nothing of the everyday occurrence. As with many such widespread beliefs, a kernel of truth was what fixed this notion in the people's minds. While the mists here did not register the same pervasive undead reaction one would detect when examining the fog blanketing the Katza plains, it provided cover from the undead that periodically spilt over its borders. It was the perfect situation in which weak undead such as common zombies and skeletons could come up on the unwary without notice. Here, one stayed indoors, or at least stayed within the bounds of the better guarded areas of the larger villages and towns, until the sun burned the morning shroud away, The small village where they currently gathered was much the same. If they had not chosen to assemble here, it would have remained silent save for the noise of local livestock. In pairs and trios, more paladins trickled in with their mounts and baggage. No squires could be seen amongst them. To be without their attendants was an uncommon sight, one only seen when paladins were forming for a devastating assault against the amassed enemies of the theocracy. Given their location, they might have been mistaken to be doing just that. Even the tense atmosphere they carried with them had the sense of a cavalier preparing for the decisive charge. The approach of hooves on the rough pavement kept his gaze riveted in the same direction. Then a familiar face emerged from the fog. Coming down the slope through the road from the southern edge of the village was a middle-aged man astride his mount, his salt and pepper hair already well thinned and showing the sheen of his scalp. The man grinned broadly through his thick beard as his brown eyes met Marcus' own and the distance closed between them. Marcus stepped up to clasp arms with him after he dismounted before him. "The Grand Masters must be crazy," Marcus said heartily, "sending someone like you to lead this contingent." "This may be so," the man admitted, "but I doubt they are so crazy as to send anyone better. I have not seen your ugly face in half a decade. How is it that you have not gotten yourself buried in the plains yet?" "Maybe it is because I am getting old," Marcus replied. "Then again, I suppose this is why any of us were chosen." "Lorenzo. Old and expendable?" Lorenzo raised an eyebrow. "Well seasoned and wise," Marcus returned. "Anyone else may well be stirring up trouble, eh, Captain?" Lorenzo grunted, taking a draught from his flask. Marcus figured it all for banter, as all who joined them would have been subjected to the same stern instruction on the nature of their task. Out of the multitude of paladin orders in the slain theocracy, a mere 36 individuals had been chosen to assemble at the northern border on the highway leading to Rantel. "I cannot decide which is crazier," he said, "that we are being sent into this pit of hell, or the reason why." "No one is above the law," Lorenzo shrugged, "not the Grand Masters of the Orders, nor the High Council itself. I heard that the bishop up north sent a dozen requests for personnel, only to be rejected each time for the obvious reasons. He blindsided everyone with that ordinance that we all took for granted, so here we are." Marcus gave a short bark of a laugh as he recalled the face of the Bishop of Altamura. The aged cleric could not even keep his face straight while conveying the missive. It was normal enough to see temple guards posted in the theocracy, where the paladin orders had a role in the more militant matters of the ministry. It was unheard of in Riastais and Baharuth, where the secular governments frowned at even the faintest idea of any religion gaining power beyond its lawful purview. That being said, the ordinance was used by the shrewd Bishop of Rantel to obtain more staff for the temples, and the paladins had been co-opted into civilian ministry. Even so, Marcus had heard it was quite the uphill battle. According to the Bishop of Altamura, the initial request had been for 4 times their number. That in itself begged belief, since it meant that the Duchy of Rantel had over 100,000 followers of the 6 great gods, after it had been annexed by the Sorceress Kingdom. When it was a part of Riastais, the number was closer to 60,000, the vast majority living in the southern territories near the theocracy. A flood of refugees crossed over the border into the theocracy in the days leading up to and following the annexation, so it was loosely speculated that perhaps half of that number remained to face whatever came. It turned out that the Bishop of Rantel desired that number for future expansion, and that the actual needs were for roughly 70,000. This number had still shocked Marcus silent when he had first heard it, and even now it was hard to accept. Apparently, even after the flight of so many, the faith of the 6 great gods was experiencing an unprecedented resurgence under the rule of an undead sovereign. There were not enough priests and they had no paladins. Out of desperation, paladins had been called in to do the work of priests. Still, the number had been whittled away to half of what was mandated by law. First on grounds that the paladins would see little in the way of their regular duties there, so there was no need for such a sudden show of force that might be perceived as aggressive posturing. The second was caution, uncertain what would happen. They had only committed to the fulfillment of the ordinance in stages. If no incidents occurred with the first half, then the remainder would be dispatched. Not that there was a lack of volunteers. Once word inevitably got out, thousands of paladins had come forward to pledge themselves to the plight of the beleaguered bishop, except the vast majority of those paladins surely had the wrong idea in their heads and would have immediately started no end of trouble. In the end, the 36 assembled had been picked out as he had described them, seasoned, wise of the outside world and not prone to acts of blind zealotry. Hopefully. "Oh, Brother Marcus," a cheerful voice called out to him, "you have come as well." Save for one. Marcus turned his gaze up the road again, towards the slight figure trotting her speckled white mare directly towards him. Her olive eyes sparkled with the same cheer in her voice, and the morning breeze played through the lazy waves of her shoulder-length blonde hair. "That's right, Sister Alessia," he answered her greeting. "I do not mean to question orders from above, but are you absolutely sure you can handle what lies ahead of us? His Excellency the Bishop of Irantal has personally requested my presence. How can my lowly self refuse such a summons?" Marcus turned to look out worriedly over the concealed valley. The request for the young paladin was incomprehensible, a diplomatic catastrophe waiting to happen. He had no qualms about her ability as a paladin. In fact, he expected her to surpass all of the ones gathered in short order if she hadn't already, but the girl was only recently ordained, bright-eyed and full of expectations set by the temple schools and the attitudes they instilled. This was fine inside the theocracy's borders, but she was exactly the wrong type of person to send to help the civilian ministry in a place where the smallest incident might spell war. The theocracy had taken a neutral stance with their neighbor, which was received in return, but the youths of the theocracy were the sort that could wantonly change that stance in the blink of an eye. He recalled Bishop Hostein's written instructions regarding the girl: "Keep her from doing anything rash until you reach the cathedral. We will take care of her from there." He wondered what the man had in mind. Marcus wasn't even sure if they could keep her from doing anything rash either. Maybe they should just tie her up and throw a sack over her head. It would surely look strange, but far preferable to a mishap. Eyeing her full plate armor and assortment of weapons, he thought that if the hammer was absent, one would be less tempted to swing at any perceived nails. "Sister Alessia." "Yes, Brother Marcus?" "The journey will be a few days. Change out of your armor and put on something more comfortable." "I hear and obey, brother, but why me?" "We will be rotating duties since we don't have any squires along with us for this. You can add your things to the baggage train." "Yes, Brother Marcus," she bowed slightly. "Please excuse me." He waved her away and sounds of clattering metal followed Alessia as she jogged away with her pack. Marcus's gaze followed after her worriedly, and Lorenzo spoke after she disappeared behind a farmstead. "You really think that is necessary?" He stroked his beard. "It makes it seem even worse since you know her." "I will admit that she has a measure of temperance," Marcus replied, "but she is still too young. It is one thing to let them loose in Katsura or out on the borders against those we are openly hostile against. Where we are going, however, her first mistake might be her last, and ours as well. Like a raw young paladin I used to know?" Lorenzo raised a bushy eyebrow at him. "That is exactly what I am afraid of, old friend," he replied. 20 years ago, we were young and eager, but we cut our teeth against the undead of Katsura and warred against the beastmen on behalf of the Dragonic Kingdom. We cooled our heels patrolling the borders of Abelian, and we had time to see the world without worrying about who we were up against. Our enemies were the enemies we were raised to fight. "Maybe there is a young priestess in need of an adjutant," Lorenzo offered. "That is the only reason I can think of for her being here. She cannot be older than 16? 14. Lorenzo rolled his eyes. "Next, you are going to tell me she was born wearing armor?" Marcus turned his gaze towards the building Alessia had disappeared behind. "She is an orphan. Once the local temple identified her aptitudes, her path was chosen for her, so you could indeed say that it is indeed the case." "Humph. Most squires would be covetous of such aptitude, but here you are acting like the blessing of the gods is some sort of curse." "Of course not," Marcus replied. "But she is young, strong, and assured of her foundations. She was just recently my squire, and I look forward to her bright future, but this new generation is even more zealous than our own. Sending one out into a nation ruled by what she was trained to fight against since childhood is folly." According to the reports, Lorenzo's gaze scanned the riverbank as he spoke. "Life is much the same as before in the north, no? There are some things in the reports that raise eyebrows, but of human affairs, they have nothing interesting to say. With all the refugees from this spring, half of the theocracy was preparing for an undead invasion. Look, the mist has cleared enough now and you can see the result of all their panic." Marcus looked down towards the river and saw the panic Lorenzo was referring to. The southern bank had undergone extensive fortification, with earthworks and emplacements for archers and siege weapons raised every 100 meters as far as he could see. Deep rows of sharpened stakes linked the spaces between each one, presenting a barrier against the swarms of undead which had been imagined to be right on the heels of the refugees. The defenses were still manned, but after months of standing constant vigil, the sentries must have surely gotten bored of the view on the other side. Opposite the southern bank lay a dirt road that followed the river along its course. Beyond the road was a fence that looked like it had been recently patched up. Beyond the fence were vast orchards and more orchards that lay beyond them. Marcus could even see people working on the other side. Apparently, they did not think to stay in while the mist still was out. A traveler unaware of the circumstances behind the fortifications on the theocracy's side of the river would have surely thought that the local authorities were dangerously deranged. Even seeing it himself and knowing the reasoning behind their defensive preparations, he felt a bit embarrassed. It was a colossal expenditure of manpower, materials and supplies. 10,000 soldiers set along the entire length of the river to watch farmers tend to their fruit trees on the other side. Taxes would be most unkind this year, all for an undead horde that had most rudely declined to make an appearance. Voices called out from behind them as the final group of paladins arrived, reporting to Lorenzo before adding their things to the awaiting baggage train. Their captain waited for them to finish before calling everyone together. His gaze swept over them as they gathered, and he cleared his throat loudly before speaking. "I will go on right out and say what pretty much everyone is probably feeling right now," he said dryly. "This is the strangest mission that any of us has ever been assigned to. We have been roped into what are normally rearguard duties, beyond what should be the front line against a nation full of all the nasties that we fight on a regular basis. Except our nation has declared themselves strictly neutral with this scary new neighbor, so make of that what you will. Just do not ask me what I think about it, it has been giving me a headache for weeks." The assembled paladins offered little in reaction, returning to ready themselves for the journey when it seemed that their captain had nothing more to say to them. Lorenzo had said pretty much all that there was to say for the moment. After a few minutes, someone approached with a question. "Should we be displaying our banners?" the paladin asked. "I do not see why not," Lorenzo answered. "We are a neutral envoy entering the lands of our neutral neighbor to do neutral things neutrally. What if we come under attack by the undead? Then we will deal with them neutrally, too. Make sure you raise those banners in the most neutral way possible." The paladin furrowed his brow as he considered what exactly that would be. In the end, 6 banners were raised for the procession in what could be considered a parade column. Lorenzo mounted and rode up to the head of the column, wheeling his warhorse around to face everyone. His eyes went over to the half-dozen wagons, still parked and being loaded. "Looks like we need a few minutes still to finish preparations," he said. "I will be heading across to see what is going on the other side, so be ready at the bridge by the time I get back. Marcus, with me."